Where's Speed Reed? Speed, are you here? You're here? Guess who else is here? My wife, Barbara, right down there. That was lame. That was better. This morning, I just have one question and two stories. Both of the stories are kind of mystical, weird experiences that happened to me actually in the Garden of Gethsemane. The last one, I really don't want to tell you because it's somewhat humiliating, to be honest with you. Not just humbling, but humiliating. So I'll save that to the end. The first story happened about a month ago. I was sitting there in the Garden of Gethsemane. There's about 6 people on this tour. No, there's exactly 6 people on this tour. And we sat down, and I kind of gave them an orientation of the purpose and power of Gethsemane. Like they didn't know why this was such an important piece of geography. And then I just said, why don't you go find an olive tree? They're all around there, you know, and use it as kind of a personal prayer closet. And everyone then walked off and sat under their own olive tree, except for me. I liked where I was, so I stayed there. It was a great view, looking over the wall of Jerusalem and the dome of the rock towering over the wall. And Perry stayed too. Now, Perry, he didn't stay because he wanted to be with me. He stayed, I don't know why he stayed. He just wanted to, I guess. He's about 2 feet away from me, and this is what we're looking at here. Perry's in his own little world. Perry, he has his own little world. This guy, he's actually Shaquille O'Neal's manager. And he works in this kind of environment that is not Christian, and so he would be the first to tell you he struggles with his walk with Christ. And so there's Perry, here I am, and what I'm struggling with is how Jesus made such a change in Gethsemane. You know, that was the watershed of his passion. Everything going into Gethsemane is like halted steps. He says to his disciples, I'm sorrowful to the point of death. And then his body proved it when he sweat, drops of blood came out with a sweat. You remember that? He said, God, I don't want to go through this. Take this cup from me. 3 times he prayed in triplicate. Gethsemane, leading up to Gethsemane, was angst and pain. But leading out of Gethsemane, Jesus is a different person. His chest is out, his head is up, he controls the arrest, he controls the trial. When Pilate plies him with questions, he's in total control. When Caiaphas heaps abuse and accusations on him, he's in control. Even on the cross, pinned there to a tree between heaven and earth, Jesus is in control. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So my question is, what made such a difference with Jesus? So that Gethsemane is this watershed that he goes in all dark and comes out so strong and powerful. It has to be the prayer, right? Because that is Gethsemane. 3 times, Father, take this cup from me. And if any of you have ever heard me preach on that passage, I just want to apologize right now. I was wrong. Because I kept saying that God answered him 3 times, no, no, no. God did not answer him. That was the point. Jesus' impassioned plea was met with dead silence. That would not encourage me to walk out with resilience. You? And so I'm sitting there thinking about Jesus. What made such a difference to him in the garden? And suddenly I looked up at what was above my head. Right there is the western gate of the city, or the eastern gate of the city. And towering above it is the Golden Dome. That is a holy site for Islam, second most holy site for Islam in the world. But it is only half the height of the Temple of Jerusalem. So you do the math. You are right now seeing half of the Dome of the Rock. Jesus saw 3/4 of the temple. And it too was laden with gold. And at Passover, it's a full moon. What an eerie sight that would be. All that gold in the moonlight, that would just be awesome. And 2 things that Jesus has said about this temple. 1, that's going to be destroyed. Because of the disobedience of Israel, it's going to be razed to the ground. He didn't say it once or even twice. 3 times, Jesus said, the temple will be destroyed. He gave very specific prophecies about being surrounded by Roman armies. You know the drill, Matthew 24. But when Jesus was saying this, he also knew that temple was Him. He said, I am this temple, and if you destroy this body in 3 days, I'll raise it up again. How can you pray in the Garden of Gethsemane, looking at that, knowing that that is you, and not realize this is your destiny? The answer to Jesus' prayer was staring Him in the face. If He's the temple, there's no way around the cross. It's a straight line from Gethsemane till Golgotha. I was blown away by this revelation. I mean, it was like it came to me from God. I know that sounds weird to you, but listen to the end of the story. Usually when people are praying, I don't disturb them. And Perry was deep into it, and he's writing furiously in his journal. And I said, man, I hate to disturb you in this sacred moment, in this pivotal place, but I've just had a thought that had never passed through my cerebellum before. Can I share it with you? And Perry goes, yeah, sure. And so I began to unpack what I just did for you. His eyes got huge. And for a moment I thought, man, this is good stuff. And then I realized that what he was so surprised about. He took his journal and turned it around and shoved it in my lap. And I began to read the exact words that I had just said to him. I mean, like 80% of the words were exactly the same. And that's when my eyes got big and I realized this did come from God. Jesus' prayer was answered not from heaven, but when the stones themselves cried out across the Kidron Valley. That was powerful for me. And since that time, I've been thinking more about it, and I realized it wasn't just the stones that cried out that were in front of him. It wasn't just the temple that answered his prayer. It was the very mountain itself. The temple was in front of him, and the Mount of Olives was behind him. And if you were to back up the hill, this is what you would see. This goes back to Tuesday when Monty preached here. If you go to the next slide, please. On top of the hill, you get this incredible panoramic view of the entire city. And when Jesus got on his donkey, this is what he saw. Now, it wasn't the Dome of the Rock. It was the temple that stood twice as high. And the tall skyscrapers in the background, you can just erase that from the picture. But pretty much everything else is the same. And from on top of this mountain, Jesus begins to walk down on what we call the triumphal entry. And Monty, you were right to pull out the word joyfully. In fact, pull up the text on this, and we'll read this. When he came near the place where the road goes down the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began joyfully, that's the theme of your sermon, Monty, to praise God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. The crowds were twitterpated, no doubt. Jesus was not. Notice, when he came near the place, the road goes down the Mount of Olives. Let's go down the mount just a little bit and down the text a few verses later. We will read these words starting in verse 41. As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, so he's come down the Mount of Olives. I don't know, halfway, two-thirds, but you know where you are when you come halfway down the Mount of Olives? You're within a stone's throw away from the Garden of Gethsemane. And near the Garden of Gethsemane, he weeps over the city. And actually, it's a subtle threat. If even you had known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes for the sake of space, I've cut out some of the most obvious threats to Jerusalem. You did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. Luke 19, 41-44. The crowds are joyful. Jesus is not. Because he's looking at this city and he's seeing the panoramic view of the people he loves and the city he loves, the city of God, and he knows that has to be destroyed. And Jesus is aware of what this mountain is really all about. In fact, if you're going down the Mount of Olives, down the road, so-called, to Gethsemane, on your right-hand side, that's the north, that is going to be this garden grove of olive trees. On your left, you know what you see? Some of you do. Show them. Those are tombs. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of tombs. Why are so many Jews buried there? Well, it has to do with the prophecy back in the book of Zechariah. Chapter 14, verse 4 says this. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. That's Yahweh's feet. East of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west. That would put the Garden of Gethsemane on the north and the tombs on the south. And through this valley that's been created, Yahweh enters the city, forming a great valley. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. That is the promise of the resurrection, you know. And so the Jews reading this prophecy said, well, if God is going to come and split Mount of Olives, I want to be there when it happens. And in the last days, at the end of time, when God comes and stomps on the Mount of Olives, creates the valley, and enters the city, I want to be the first to greet him at the resurrection. So they are the huge expenses paid to be buried right there. In fact, this next slide will show you up close what some of the coffins look like. And people come and they take little stones and they put them as memorials on these coffins. Question. Do you think Jesus was acutely aware of the theology of the Mount of Olives? A promise not only of death, but a promise of resurrection. Well, okay, duh. Yeah. But check this out, Zechariah 9, verse 9. Jesus enacted this on purpose. On the top of the Mount of Olives, he gets on a donkey because Zechariah 9:9, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey. Jesus was not only aware of it, he set it up so that you couldn't miss it. You know what stands between Zechariah 9:9 and Zechariah 14:4? Zechariah 12:10. It is the only scripture in all of the Hebrew Bible that predicts the suffering of Yahweh. It says there that God, Yahweh, will pour out a spirit of supplication and grace upon Israel. And they will look on him, get this, him who they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as an only son. And you have here an inexplicable verse to the ancient rabbis. How do you combine Yahweh getting pierced with a son? It even changes from first person to third. I will pour out a spirit of supplication. They will mourn for him, the one they have pierced, like an only son. Without the cross, that verse makes no sense. And Jesus had that in his mind in the garden. He knew that he was the one whose feet would be put on the Mount of Olives, that would split it asunder, and he would be the one to usher in Yahweh into Jerusalem for the people of God. But he knew that you don't get to Jerusalem through the Garden of Gethsemane except through Golgotha. There is a road not to Gethsemane, but through Gethsemane. And on one side you have death, literally, and on the other side you have life. That was the second answer to Jesus' prayer. The first was the temple in front of him. The second was the mountain behind him. The third was the valley below him. And if you go to the base of the Mount of Olives, it's called the Kidron Valley. And if you walk through the Kidron Valley, it looks like this. There are three major tombs there. You can see one just a little bit over to the right, the one with a couple of pillars, and in the middle with the triangle, the pyramid top, that is a major monument. Up behind there are all the tombs I showed you a moment ago. Same picture, different perspective. When Jesus walked from the upper room to the Garden of Gethsemane, this is the road he took. When he walked from the Mount of Olives into Jerusalem for the triumphal entry, he went from the top of the hill where the trees are in the very upper left hand of the picture, down around the left-hand side. You can see the city street a little bit, and then down into the valley. Jesus that week walked both ways. But on the night that he was betrayed, going into Gethsemane, this is the path he took. And he walked right by this monument here in the middle. It wasn't built until sometime after Jesus. But it was a monument built probably on top of an earlier monument. Does anyone know to whom this monument was built? Absalom. Does anybody know the story of Absalom? Huh? He was the son of David. Hello. Who chased his father out of town, had a successful coup, actually, and David had to run out of town. And the scriptures say, 2 Samuel 15, that when David went up the Mount of Olives, David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. Where Jesus wept at the triumphal entry, where Jesus wept in the garden, is a stone's throw away from where David wept. His head was covered, and he was barefoot. Now that is obvious enough. As Jesus walks that night, meditating that he is the son of David, that instead of rebelling against the kingdom and causing David to run out, he is the one now. He is the David being run out of the city and rejected by his people. But that was not the end of David's kingdom. And it was not the end of Jesus' prayer. When he understood that King David had walked this very path, King David had gone this same way, but King David also was brought back in by the grace of God. And Jesus, through the power of God, would be brought back to life for the salvation of the world. How could Jesus not be thinking about these things? I think he was thinking not only about 2 Samuel 15, but 2 Samuel 16:1. Take a look at this. When David had gone a short distance beyond the summit, he reached the top of the Mount of Olives. There was Ziba, the steward of Mephibosheth, waiting to meet him. He had a string of donkeys saddled and loaded. Usually we think of Jesus getting on a donkey like Solomon did, riding to his coronation. There was another donkey that was saddled on top of that hill one day. And it wasn't for glory. It was for suffering. And I think Jesus, in the Garden of Gethsemane that night, he prayed 3 times. And one time he prayed, he could look at the temple. And God, though silent, spoke through the stones, "This is your destiny." And the second time he prayed, he could think of the mountain that he was on, the mountain that was behind him. He sat in the shadow of this hill that had eschatological import. And on this mountain was the promise that God would come through. But even in the promise of Zechariah 14, I know we didn't read this passage, but Zechariah 14 says, "A day of the Lord is coming, Jerusalem, when your possessions will be plundered and divided up within your very walls." This is Zechariah 14:1. Verse 2, "I will gather all the nations to Jerusalem to fight against it. The city will be captured, the houses ransacked, and the women raped. Half the city will go into exile, but the rest of the people will not be taken from the city. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as he fights on a day of battle. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two." There's our text. You can't get to that text except through the suffering of Jerusalem. And so Jesus had one answer from the temple, and one answer from the mountain, and one answer from the very path he walked in front of Absalom and the whole history of David. There technically is not a road to Gethsemane. Theologically, there's not a road to Gethsemane. There's a road through Gethsemane. Gethsemane is not where you go. What matters is where you go from here. And so Jesus is in Gethsemane determining his destiny. And here's my second story. A year and a half ago, I was in Gethsemane. I was not facing Jerusalem this time. I was facing away from Jerusalem. I don't know why. But I had my hand on this old gnarled olive tree. It'll look something like this. And I was just praying to God, and I'm not thinking about Jesus' prayer. Actually, I'm thinking about Peter. Because the road to Gethsemane was never intended to be traveled alone. The road that Jesus led to the cross is not just what he did for you. It is the vocation that he gave to you. The cross is not your gift for eternal life merely. It is what you are to strap to your back daily. And if you can't have a cross strapped to your back and live a life of self-abnegation and suffering, then Jesus said it multiple times. More than anything else he said, actually. He said, if you do not have a cross, if you don't take up your cross and follow after me daily, you cannot be my disciple. So there I am in the garden. I got my hand on this tree. I know this is going to sound weird. You can call me a weirdo later if you like. I recognize I'm a weirdo for this, but the tree started to move. Now, I'm not saying the tree literally got up and danced, but there was something in the tree. Have you ever been in a room and someone came in and you realized you weren't alone and that your hair on the back of your neck stood up? You recognize there's another presence there. I felt that, but it wasn't from behind me. It was through the tree to my hand. I know, this is weird. And I opened my eyes, and the gnarled bark of the oak appeared to me as if it was moving like the waves on the ocean, just kind of stirring. And I'm trying to focus on this because I'm a bit weirded out, actually. And then there was this sentence, a very short sentence, that was just embedded on my mind. I'm thinking about Peter sleeping. And what I hear is this. And maybe it was my own conscience, and maybe I had a bad bowl of matzah. I don't know what it. Or maybe Jesus was speaking to me. What I heard was, I'm still alone. And I didn't take that as an accusation for the rest of the world. I took it personally. I think that's how he meant it. I'm still asleep in the garden. He's called me to a road from Gethsemane to the cross. I'm still protecting myself, my finances, my emotions, my career. I'm still living so much for me that Jesus would say to me, I'm still alone here because my best friends and those who call themselves my disciples are still sleeping. I still haven't figured out what to do with that.